I see Jen and Jonah joined the room, so maybe they can talk to check if the mics and the sound is okay.
Hello, Jen here. Can you hear me?
Hi Jen, yes, can hear you fine. It's Aidan here. You're perhaps a little bit faint. So just a quick sound check again. This is Aidan here. If everybody can hear me, if you could give a smiley face. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, fantastic. Well,
Perfect, Aidan, go ahead.
We're going to get started and let people join as they do. So again, welcome everybody. It's fantastic. We have so many people on the call and more to join. We're delighted that we have Jen Donville on the call with us. Jen is a consultant with us who's helping us really move forward with this guidance on gender transformative education. What is it and what does it mean for Plan? I'm really grateful to Veronica and Helen for helping get the word out today about this. So thank you so much. Muchas gracias. So just before we actually get stuck in, we just want to check where you're joining us from today. So if you could use one of the arrows to just identify, or the star, where you're joining us from today, that would be fantastic.
Sorry, Aidan, to interrupt you, but your sound is not really clear. Are you talking with a mic, or are you talking just in a room openly?
Veronica, yes, I'm talking in a room openly. I can change that.
Yeah, that would be nice, thanks.
Okay.
Veronica, can you hear me properly? It's Jen here.
This is Yona. I'm not hearing you very well, Jen. I'm not hearing anybody very well.
Okay, I'll turn my microphone up. Is that any better now?
Much better.
Okay, great. So while Aidan plugs himself in, I'll just say hello and thanks for having me. My name is Jen Donville. I'm a former gender equality advisor with Plan International Canada. Some of you I've met before, and I'm really pleased to be working with Yona, Aidan, and the team on this important project. So looking forward to our discussion today.
So for those who just joined us, Aidan is just fixing his microphone. Hello, this is Yona Nestel. I'm the Senior Education Policy and Advocacy Advisor with the Global Hub. We are just asking you to use an X or a star or an arrow to indicate on the map where you are joining us from today.
Great. I see people are signed in and letting us know where you are. So fantastic to see we have people from Central America, from West Africa, Southern Africa, Scandinavia, Europe, North America. This is great. Okay, fantastic. and more colleagues will join. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, because we're going to try to keep this session as interactive as possible, but just to give everybody an overview of what the objectives of the session are, of this online consultation. So first of all, it's to share information of what gender transformative education means for Plan. There's been so many questions around that over the last 2 years. I hope people can hear me better. This is the best I can do with my microphone. And secondly, to update on progress that we have made on developing guidance for gender transformative education. And thirdly, to engage colleagues from different thematic areas on how this guidance can be strengthened to meet the programming influence and needs and opportunities of the organization across development and humanitarian work. So they're the three objectives of today's consultation. And as I said, we're going to try to keep it as interactive as possible. So just to let you know, for those of you who may not have used Blackboard in the past, many of you have, but we have the talk button up here in the corner. If you want to talk, just press that button and then press it again to mute. We will be using some polls, so just here you'll see a short arrow. We'll get to use that in a moment. And the participants list, you can see here who are the participants on the call. We have a number of whiteboard tools that many of you just use now. The text, for example, to click there to write, so you can, the typing tool. Further here below, if you don't feel like using the whiteboard, we have the chat room. And so you can make comments or questions in that section there. Okay. And again here, if you need to step away, you can step away and let us know. We have smiley face, emoticons, applause, confusion. Hopefully that won't happen. Approval, disapproval, and very importantly, raise hands. Thank you, Pedro. This is really important if people want to come in, so we can order the comments as they come in. And again, the polling. Okay. So with that, we're going to start actually using them. So this is a keyword exercise. So if you'd like to just share some keywords from your perspective around what does gender transformative education mean to you in your context. So feel free to use the text box, the A button here, or write in the chat box. So over to you. So we'll take a moment just to see what people are adding in here. And if anybody likes to take the microphone, please do as well.
Now we should say whether this is anonymous or whether we can see what people are writing in. I think it's anonymous, isn't it?
If it's on the whiteboard, it's anonymous. If it's in the chat box, it's not. Okay. So as they come out, just so to be real for the context, addressing root causes and social norms, to be realistic, being transparent, open and accountable, some of the comments in the chat box, equal benefit and enjoyment of education, fantastic, feminist, being feminist within our gender transformative education, challenging power structures, such an important part of our work. Now just to let everybody know, we are actually recording this, webinar, so for those of you who do want to listen back on this afterwards, we will share the recording. Addressing the root causes of inequality. Systems levels of change in education. Okay. Giving agency. Such a core part of our work of giving particularly girls and young women's agency. A claim the plan uses in advocacy events. Making sure curriculum does not reinforce stereotypes. Fantastic. Very, very important part of our work. Education becomes a platform for girls to learn, lead, and thrive. Fantastic. So again, making the link back with our global strategy. Building a more equal society, leveraging girls' and boys' abilities to, not sure what that says, creating platforms for discussions and learning that challenge pre-existing power dynamics around gender. Very important. So again, the power dynamics and power structures are central to our work. Tackling stereotypes, again, to avoid girls getting access to education. Teachers actively promoting gender equality in the classroom and through teaching methodologies. Fantastic. And we can see some more comments in the chat box. I won't read them all, but education processes and content that contribute to greater awareness among students that are equitable and inclusive for everybody participating in the education process. Excellent. Building critical consciousness among students, the need to consider teacher training and developing teacher capacity to address gender issues. So many of these issues resonate with what we've already included in the IQE, the Inclusive Quality Education Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, which is fantastic. So Stephanie has a question here. I see the title, does the term actually mean something to anybody in anybody's context? It's relevant to people on the call with their own particular context, Stephanie. I'm not too sure if that's clear to you.
Now, I was just wondering whether the external world can relate to it, Aidan.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Stephanie?
Yes, I just said, I was wondering whether this term says anything to anybody outside of plan. Is this something that the sector has started to speak about?
Yes, I would
I'm not
say
so
so.
sure whether it means anybody to somebody living in a rural village in, let's say, Guinea, for example.
Okay, that's a great question, Stephanie. And yes, people have started to talk about it. In fact, just yesterday we received the a guidance that Oxfam have actually prepared, and it's there's quite a lot of discussion around it, and we're going to come back to that during the call. But I see Yona has her hand up. Yona, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I can, yeah.
Okay. There is someone wrote here something around a claim plan uses an advocacy event, which as an advocacy person, I find very interesting. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but one of the reasons why we really want to push on with this work is we want our programs and our advocacy messages to be speaking to one another. So thank you for putting that out.
Great. Fantastic. So we're going to come back to a lot of these issues during the call. We thought this was an important, just a very brief check-in with people to see, what is your understanding of the term gender transformative education in your context. So we're just going to move on and do two quick polls. to help us also. So the first poll is around the question, how confident do you feel being able to describe or define gender transformative education? So when we have 4 multiple choice responses, A, not at all, B, very little, C, some, or D, lots. So if you take a moment and use the arrow poll up in the corner, I'm going to just a moment. There you go. So you should have 4 options now available. So choose whichever one you feel reflects how confident you feel. Okay, I see people are starting to vote. We can see, I can see certainly the answers come in. We'll wait a moment before publishing. Okay, so just for those of you who haven't done it yet, so just the poll, check on the letter A, B, C, or D here. Okay, so two more seconds and then we'll publish. Okay, so here are the results. So as you can see, the majority of people on the call actually say somewhat. A number didn't, perhaps because of just not being used to the polling exercise. But this is a quick exercise, so people feel somewhat comfortable being able to describe what gender transformative education means. But that certainly means that we have a lot of work. The most important thing there is nobody put in D, lots. So that's going to take a long time for us to get there, and a call like this is important. Okay, so we'll move on to the next poll. And that is, how much experience do you have in education components that can contribute to gender transformative education? And we will be talking about components of education during the call. So what are the different elements that can contribute to gender transformative education?
And I'll just point out that if you want to vote, if you go up to the letter, there's like the put your hand up, there's the emoticons at the top above the list of participants. If you hover over the letter there, it'll say respond to poll, and then it'll give you a drop down. So that's where you can vote there rather than clicking on the whiteboard in case you haven't used the polling feature yet.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Jen. Okay, so how much experience do you have in education components that can contribute to gender transformative education? None, some, an average amount, lots. Great, and we have almost 20 in so far. Fantastic. Okay, so here we go. So we have 30% of colleagues who voted say that you have an average amount of experience. We have 10% of those who voted that they say you have none, and 16% say you have some. So again, this speaks to the fact that we really do need to accompany colleagues and collectively ensure that we can provide the guidance that will allow you to be able to gradually develop that experience by putting that guidance into practice. Okay, and we will have a poll later on in the webinar. But with that, I hope that was helpful just to give a quick snapshot of where people are at. So I'm going to hand over to Jen now, who's going to talk us through more about the guidance and the process.
Can everybody hear me clearly? I hope so. If you can't, then please do raise your hand or mention it in the chat box. So today we've gone through a bit of a kind of introduction to start everybody off. And what we'd like to really do is give an overview of the process of developing this guidance note, and as well as having a chance to gather some feedback, most importantly. I think we can see that you know, there's a lot of different types of experience within the room and within PLAN, and this is kind of an effort to bring that together and start to kind of form a consistent path forward for PLAN staff, partners, and then also external communications. So today we're going to go through an outline of where we're at in terms of drafting out the various parts of this guidance, and then a discussion, hopefully for a good half hour, 45 minutes of discussion, and then a wrap up. And it's important to note that if your perspective in this discussion is not heard, or if we're if we kind of have to cut some portions short, then some discussion short, that getting in touch after this call is welcome to continue that feedback. And so, or if you would rather just email afterwards, that's fine too. So I'll just go ahead then with the presentation. So the purpose of the guidance, we just kind of wanted to frame the discussion to make sure that the feedback that we get through this consultation and then afterwards is really kind of focused in on what the intention is of this guidance, because we know that there are many discussions that could happen about all kinds of aspects of our programming and the organization and different levels that we function at PLAN, but we really want to kind of keep it focused so that it's able to practically take on feedback as most efficiently as possible. So the purpose of the guidance is several. So the first is to establish a common language on what PLAN means by gender transformative education. I think we saw from Aidan's poll that people have various perceptions of their ability to describe or define gender transformative education, and take comfort because you're not alone. This sector, both gender equality sectors and education sectors are struggling in a good way to come together around understanding what that means for their organization and more broadly for the sector. Second is to provide accessible guidance for PLAN staff and partners. And so it's important that this guidance is practical, usable, readable, and owned by PLAN staff, in that not just for the technical leads in education and gender, but for practitioners and partners as well. The purpose is also to showcase examples of PLAN education programming components, of which there are many that contribute to gender transformative education. And so part of our consultation with you all and beyond is to see if you have some examples and case studies that you would like to contribute that could help make what we're talking about in this guidance real and tangible to its audience. So keep that in mind, please, as we go through. To demonstrate alignment, of course, with PLAN International's technical foundation in gender equality and inclusive quality education. So obviously we want this guidance to fit in the broader package of PLAN policy and programming. To situate PLAN's approach to transformative education within a community of practice. and note that this is an evolving community of practice. So as Aidan mentioned, we just were shared the kind of final published Oxfam learning note, they've called it, on transformative education. UNICEF, as was mentioned, I think, in the chat box, has just come out with its online e-tool kit on the same. So it is evolving, and it's a conversation that's very current in the sector. So we're at the right time in the right place for this discussion. Right, so the scope of the guidance. So in order for us to feedback and discuss what we're outlining, it's important for us to understand who it's for and who it's not for. So the internal audience for this is staff in plan international country offices, regional offices, national organizations, and liaison officers. Liaison officers, I'm not familiar with that position, but you all, I'm sure, will know it. The external audience, and this is for the external audience to inform and influence. So we would like this to be useful to an external audience in terms of informing our colleagues of PLAN's position and our approach, but also to influence, because PLAN does play a role in these discussions at the global level and within the community of practice in terms of influencing how approaches from a gender equality perspective are spoken about and positioned amongst our colleagues. So that's important as well. I'm just trying to look at the chat room as well. I think that we're good. The situation and parameters of the guidance. So where does it sit within PLAN? And how are we kind of framing it in terms of trying to contain it and make it, a purposeful document? So the guidance is first a response to requests from PLAN staff for a technical support document with practical examples. So I think, as we said in the purpose is that a common language is very useful when we start to kind of try and formulate a consistent approach. An expression of the next step in defining our approach to transformative education programs. So I think it's important that it's recognized as a part of an evolving conversation within PLAN, but as a very important and substantial first step in looking at how we formulate and define gender transformative education programming. The parameters of the guidance, it's a description and a discussion of the many potential components of gender transformative education programming, rather than a finite programming model. I think amongst the discussions that I've had with Aidan and Yona, and I think discussions that Yona and Aidan have had in in quite a bit of the work that's gone up to lead up to this point, is that in order to respond to the various experience of different PLAN offices across the Federation, but in order also to recognize the complexity of designing context-specific and appropriate education programming that is transformative. A single programming model might not be the right approach at this moment, and so looking at the different components that comprise various models of programming or various programming designs that are on a scale of transformative and hopefully at the top end. It's a foundational guidance that will be accessible in language and scope, as mentioned previously, and it doesn't provide a ranking or rating system to define programs as transformative. And I'm sure most of you are aware that that's forthcoming, I think, at PLAN, but it won't be contained within this guidance. Practical examples or case studies will not be exhaustive of PLAN's entire experience within education, but rather will ground the conceptual guidance in practical, relatable examples that hopefully will be mostly recognizable to many PLAN staff and partners in terms of the types of education programming that they've experienced. I'm going to turn over the microphone to Yona, who's going to give us like a little bit of the broader context in terms of how this fits in the sector, and both globally in terms of our partners within UNGAI and beyond, the SDGs, and then also where we fit with our peers in the sector.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me? checking that my microphone is working.
Yeah,
Great.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So hello, everyone. My name is Yona Nestel. I'm the Senior Education Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the Global Hub. And there was some interesting chat in the chat box about whether or not, PLAN is an outlier. Are we the only ones that are talking about gender transformative education? And the answer is certainly not, because the sector has really moved forward, especially in the last, I would say, 2 years, and a lot of our peer organizations are using the term gender transformative education, and I believe that it's because of us, because we started using that term and really pushing for that term. So we are already influencing the sector at a global level. And just to go back to SDG 4 language and targets. When we agreed on the SDG 4 targets, we started using the term gender equality in and through education. And that's an important distinction and kind of evolution of how gender equality is being addressed within education. So it's not just gender equality in education, for example, gender parity in enrollment or completion or what happens in the school. It's also about how education is able to transform harmful gender norms and stereotypes and actually promote gender equality more broadly in communities and societies. So that's a big distinction and kind of advancement that was made following the SDG negotiations. And certainly in the last few years, we've had a lot of momentum, with, both G7s in the last 2 years under Canada's presidency and more recently under France's presidency, really putting gender equality in education as a centerpiece of the G7 proceedings. We had under Canada the Charlevoix Declaration, which focuses on girls' education, girls and women's education in crisis, and kind of when you drill down into some of the policy recommendations, they are what I would consider fairly gender transformative. And then this year under France's presidency, we saw the adoption of the Gender at the Center initiative, which really focuses on gender-responsive education sector planning and ensuring that the system, the education system as a whole, is taking up gender consideration. So not kind of a piecemeal approach or, standalone strategies, but looking at how we transform systems. Some of our key partners in education, so the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, UNICEF, INEE, which is the Interagency Network on Education and Emergencies, and we're now seeing some of our peer INGOs, Oxfam, for example, are really coming on board with the idea of gender transformative education, and they're actually looking to plan to help them with their thinking, because they know that in general we have done a lot of work on gender transformative programming and influencing. So for example, Oxfam has invited me and Aiden to give a seminar to their staff about our journey. So we are definitely, at the right moment and are, playing a leadership role in the sector with this work. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yona. I think that situates the conversation really well. So moving on, the guidance, before we go into the outline of the guidance, as Yona has mentioned, it's important, I think, that we recognize where plan fits within this conversation. And so what makes it distinctively plan from the perspective of the work that's been done so far towards this guidance? First is that, it is taking a feminist approach in terms of it putting the girl at the center, putting the individual at the center. So looking at the relationship between education and gender equality in its totality. So not just about access, but looking at the kind of root cause changes that need to happen at the home and the community in order for girls and boys to realize their right to lifelong learning. So it's about that whole journey through the education system, not just about enrollment on day one. It's also about having an experience within the education system itself that is inclusive, that is safe, that is promoting gender equality and individual children's rights. And then also, as Yona mentioned, importantly, it's looking at how can education be a greater, stronger tool to transform communities and societies to be more equal and inclusive. So it's looking at that entire journey and education system, but also the all of the elements that education interacts with the community. And an explicit commitment, importantly, backed by an increasing cache of resources as the inclusion team within PLAN strengthens and expands their work within the Federation to address inclusion, diversity, and intersectionality. And, you know, I think that if you look around a little bit to what else is being developed, I think you'll see that that is very much a distinctively PLAN approach within what's being produced in the sector right now. A measurement approach that goes beyond sector outcomes to look at including the voices and perspectives of individual students and potential students, children in all their diversity. So looking not just at learning outcomes, not just at completion and enrollment rates, but looking at the building of agency and the empowerment that needs to accompany an experience of learning. And capturing that through the perspective of young people themselves. And finally, of course, it's aligned and reflective, as mentioned, to key PLAN technical guidelines. And so that in and of itself makes it very distinctively PLAN, as those products are distinctively PLAN. And one of those, of course, is the 6 elements of gender transformative change. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with them. These will be threaded throughout the guidance, and it will be very important that they're recognized as being kind of a driving force, conceptual force within the guidance as we talk about the different components within education programming. One of the several here that really set us apart is that focus on agency. And then, of course, what Yona was saying in terms of an enabling environment, but that enabling environment extending right from the home up to the global policy level, right? So that enabling environment isn't just about the community or the school. It stretches from the very smallest domain to the very largest. So the outline is going to look like this, with some potential adjustments, but basically an explanation of what the guidance is, why it's needed, an introduction that helps frame it conceptually, what's gender transformative education programming, and why adopt it, why is it important, and then an overview of some of the frameworks that we discussed that support gender transformative education programming that Yona just walked us through. And then we'll go into PLAN's approach, and that will look at these 4 levels. And that's what we're going to focus on today, because I think the inputs that you all can provide will be most valuable for this section, which will be the meat, really the meat of the guidance. So the individual and community level, then the school level, the national level, and the international level. So we'll go through each of these very briefly. You've got hopefully the PowerPoint draft that Aiden sent. If you don't have it, please drop a note, and perhaps Aiden can re-forward it to you, and it can be shared. It will be useful just so that you can flip through the tables and some of the content if you'd like to reference it during your feedback over the course of the discussion. While we go through, we're asking that people keep 2 questions in mind. One is, in this, how we've organized the layers, and then the components within each layer, so the 4 layers I just mentioned, we'll talk about specific components within each of those layers. And what we'd love from the participants in the call is your brains in terms of whether there's a layer or component you think that is important that's missing, and then how can we best address it. So that's first. And then second, like I mentioned earlier in the call, it would be really wonderful if we could use this opportunity to gather as many examples of programming and case studies that we can, that can really enrich. I think especially for our colleagues in COs, for program design and to wrap their heads around what that might look like in their communities and in their own programming, I think that's especially useful. Yes, I can. There are internal audiences and external audiences, Stephanie. So the internal audience will be COs, NOs, COs, NOs, regional leads, etc., across the Federation, really. But the point will be to make sure that it is accessible to those staff members at Plan who are designing and implementing programs. Also, in terms of designing and implementing advocacy strategies, so they have the language at their fingertips. And yeah, but also technical staff, absolutely, you can use it too. Yeah, so hopefully it will be useful to both. But who exactly within Plan? Technical advisors or frontline staff? Well, I think, Stephanie, any document that provides guidance should be useful to both. So should establish the common language around what we mean by gender transformative education programming. I think it should also provide that practical framework for frontline staff to see how that conceptual guidance translates to their day-to-day work. Does that answer your question? I think it says I don't have a save. Okay, I'll move on from that. I think that for the examples, for the case studies, if you have ideas and if you have something you'd like to share, perhaps we can mention it briefly on the call, but then we can take it offline so I can gather a bit more information about that. And my email will be at the end of the slideshow as well, so you can get directly in touch with me. Okay, so in terms of how we're framing the discussion around their job. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to put a pin in that, Stephanie, for now, because as I said, we're looking at this as, I think, a part of an evolving conversation. So ideally, more detailed tools will emerge and be developed as kind of different programming models, quote unquote, come out of what is gender transformative education. I think as a first step in terms of defining it within the sector, it's more useful perhaps at this moment to kind of provide the conceptual framework and then also some practical examples. But I recognize in order for it to be practical at the ground level, some stepwise tools and practical tools would be necessary, and Aidan and Yona can speak to what the plan is for that down the line. We reconcile the technical and advocacy interpretation of the definitions, for example, empowerment. Is it strategy or an end goal, both? Yona or Aidan, do you want to take that?
Well, can I ask Shika to just verbally explain what she means exactly by this question? Can you take the mic, Shika?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I just wanted to point out, and I understand that we want to stick to the two questions. While going through the vocabulary, which I think is very critical in establishing the identity of, where plan programs and advocacy want to reach, there is a need to really reconcile the definitions document. For instance, when I was reading empowerment, the first thing that I read was that it is a strategy. Now, from a technical point of view, do we treat empowerment as a strategy or an end in itself? Because while designing the programs, agency is something which could be a strategy, but empowerment ultimately is an end in itself. And probably in my theory of change as well, that is what I want to measure. So while I understand that we both the advocacy technical team might be approaching the same thing from different standpoints but reaching the same destination. I think the vetting of any vocabulary from both the teams and a common reconciliation is extremely important. Because for me, the way empowerment is defined, number one, it is a very long description, and number two, we need to be very specific on, whether it is a strategy or a goal. So basically that.
Aidan, I think this question is best placed for you because it's more general about kind of our gender transformative approach to programming and influencing.
Yeah, thanks, Shika. The 6 elements of change, as Jen said, are critical to this, and that's what we want to make sure is reflected in these various levels. We also want to make sure that this guidance is relevant for staff who are involved in the design of programming and influencing. It's not so much for frontline staff, and I think that's relevant for your question. Of course, the terminology around this being an end goal in itself, I think is important, because this is a journey we will need to accompany this guidance with a process whereby colleagues can use this guidance when designing new programs. We need to ensure that this links with, for example, the other processes in plan, the program and influence approach, which is very important. Also the upcoming gender transformative marker, which will be official as of January 1st next year. So I think that there's still some work to be done to define exactly where this guidance sits for programming and influencing stuff.
Thanks, Aidan and Yona.
Thank you, Aidan. I think, yeah. I just wanted to sort of acknowledge Aidan's point. I think the point is well taken. Only that I think this is a very critical point also because, for instance, in Indian landscape, we are struggling to now, establish a relevance for plan. Wherein there are a lot of gender-based organizations which are extremely critical and extremely activist in their approach, and they also occupy most of the ecosystem as far as the gender-based organizations are concerned. I think the defining of this vocabulary would also help us, bringing a frame to our programs, which will then be a common ground for both advocacy and, technical staff without any confusion. So point well taken, Aidan, and I really look forward to, that kind of exchange.
Okay, thanks for that. So
maybe just to add, finally, Jen, sorry, before going on, that next month we actually have the Inclusive Quality Education Network meeting, where a number of members, many of you on the call, will actually be getting together. So that's a very critical point you've mentioned, where we're going to look at, okay, well, when we actually have this guidance, what do we do with it? How do we ensure that colleagues can use it, across development and humanitarian programming and influencing? So we'll certainly be coming back to that, Shika.
yeah, and I think it's important as well to recognize that as a part of kind of the evolving conversation at Plan, this is an effort to kind of take a first step towards, culminating everyone's experience and perspectives on gender transformative education programming. And so it's important that it's I think a living process as well. So that's great. It'll live as it moves on. So the way that we've divided it within the guidance thus far, as you can see, is the individual and community level, the school level, the national level, and the international level. And I won't read through each of these definitions. You'll have them at your fingertips to reference as we move on. But basically, you know, it's a socio-ecological model that I think most of you will be familiar with, that tries to provide an easy way to understand and approach the many components of education programming that we want to discuss. So as we move forward, we've basically looked at, you know, the following several slides are each level. The component describes kind of the general area of programming, and then we have activity examples to reflect the actual activities that would be designed into programming. The idea being that each of these activities has the potential to strengthen the contribution to transformative change within education programming. Please excuse my cat in the background if you can hear her. So beginning with the individual community level, engaging directly with girls and boys, resource and in-kind support. Many of you will recognize a lot of this work. Parental and caregiver engagement, there was a comment previously about including female caregivers, which of course they are, but we feel that it's important to explicitly also have kind of a separate and explicit activity that speaks to that number, I think 3 it is, of the 6 commitments, 6 elements of transformative change, which is the proactive and targeted engagement of men and boys in our work. Community engagement, of course, many of you will recognize the different activities within that, which is SBCC, looking at early marriage prevention. So again, looking at that root cause change at the community, household, and individual level that not only gets access increased and improved, but also looks at what is the environment for lifelong learning. And is that environment inclusive and responsive to the needs of girls and boys and others in all their diversity. Individual and community level, and then school level. So looking at school governance, school environment, and I won't read through each of the activities, but these will be ones many of you will recognize. School infrastructure, student activism, and it may seem like the usual suspects. However, these are the important elements of programming at the school level that create an environment that is safe, that is inclusive, that is responsive to the needs of students in all their diversity as well. So just going through, you can see that our case study, I'll just go back to our case study column on the right is a bit more scant than we'd like it to be. So we would really love the stories, experiences, examples from your work as well. Take a look through on your PowerPoint as well, and if is there a level and a component that you've particularly had experience in, and activities that we should be adding to these different components. This is not an exhaustive list. The potential here is great for growth, but we'd really like your inputs on that. Student activism in particular, Champions of Change is the case study we have, recognizing that there are many other models to promote student activism. And then finally the national level. So national level component, sorry, there's one more level, international level. Policy and sector planning. Many of you will be familiar with the example of GRESS and the work that was done within the UNGAI partnership and with GPE and how important that was to plan's work. And then quality teachers, of course, which is at the national level. There was another question about whether teaching practices in the classroom would be included at the school level. And it's placed at the national level because it does have to happen through a partnership with the Ministry of Education, which sits at the national level. And so usually working with teachers in in-service or pre-service training would live at the national level. And then classroom environment in terms of codes of conduct, and school governance level stuff would be at the school level. But yeah, teacher training is definitely in here, and some of you might be familiar with the gender responsive pedagogy teacher training developed by Plan International Canada. There are others as well. FAWE is a leader in that area and an emerging area. Increasingly, we're seeing those pedagogical trainings being developed across the sector. So national level teaching and learning resources. Of course, the national level for teaching and learning resources is essential. And this is looking at the inclusion of comprehensive sexuality education, looking at curricula and materials that are inclusive, that promote gender equality, that don't perpetuate gender stereotypes. And many of you will be familiar with programming like that as well. Any questions so far from anybody? Just so I can pause at this point before we continue so that I can field any questions. No? Okay, there was also one example.
Jen, sorry, some questions in there around if we can share the GRPTT package.
Yes, so the GRPTT package, some of you may know I was very involved in that, and I know before I left Plan International Canada, the package had been finalized. And I understand that NAFI is on the call. Hi, NAFI. NAFI might be able to speak to that. And also, Yona's been in touch with CNO for it to be shared more broadly. I think it's in the design phase, but ideally that would be available to everybody rather soon. But perhaps Yona or NAFI can provide an update on that.
Hi everyone. I don't have the most recent update. Maybe we can follow up on that later on if Yona has not also recent updates.
Hello everyone. This is Tanya Javed. I'm an education advisor with CNO, and what I can tell you about the GRPTT manual right now is that so it is going to go through one final review before it is ready, and however before that we are presenting it at the INEE webinar on November 14th. So hope you can join us for that, and after that we hope to have it out and available very soon.
Excellent. Thanks for that update. Soon coming, which is great. In addition to teaching and learning resources, there was also, and I'll just throw this out there because I think it would be of particular interest to include in the guidelines, which is the example of Plan Bangladesh working close with the Ministry of Education in Bangladesh to revise the curriculum. If anybody has any information on that, I would be most interested in getting in touch. And finally, the international level. Yona spoke a little bit towards this. I think that it's important to recognize that Plan does have a role and should have a role at the regional and global level in terms of creating and supporting partnerships that promote transformative education and what that looks like. And I'm sure Yona will be able to provide some more richness to the case studies, but also it would be great if anybody else has experience working at the global or regional level that they would like to share. Any advocacy, successful advocacy, regional advocacy efforts and examples would be great. So this is the basic kind of outline of what we're looking at. As we populate it with case studies and narrative, hopefully we'll be providing a really good broad picture of all of the many components that together can make increasingly transformative, gender transformative programming at a plan. A lot of it we're already doing, which is wonderful. It's hard for me to not say we, even though I'm working as a consultant. I'm still thinking of myself as a plan employee. But so yeah, this is where we're at in terms of organizing the guidance. We're hoping that the guidance will not be a tome-sized work, but will be something that is succinct, yet detailed, practical and interesting and accessible for plan staff. So we're a bit over in terms of when we were hoping to start the discussion, but if there is feedback now, please open up the mic and let's have a chat. I'd love your feedback. Yona and myself, I think, are recording this, so we'll be able to make sure that we capture it. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be able to send emails after the consultation are more than welcome.
Jen?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Thank you all.
Yes,
so I had just one question. I found yes, it is Nafi.
Okay, perhaps everybody can just say who they are when they get on when they start speaking, so everyone knows.
Yes. Okay. So Nafi, Plan International Canada, Clinical Advisor. So I found point 3, like reviewing and assessing gender transformative programming of the guidance as one of the most important parts. So I'm curious to know what will be in it, because
sorry, can you already up just a little bit?
Yeah, so I was saying that the point 3 regarding the measurement and assessment of gender transformative education programming is a very important part, and I'm curious to know what will be in it. Because I think regarding these interventions and components, we are already delivering them in pilot way and piece by piece. So I'm just wondering how these will be different from business as usual in terms of education programming. How we can put all together all these components to tell the transformative story or journey. And one important thing will be having relevant gender sensitive indicators, like having issues of value given to girls' education, or issues of domestic roles, child marriage in education programming. Just to say that we need really in a gender transformative education programming to achieve gender equality outcomes like domestic roles, child marriage, and education outcomes simultaneously.
Yes. So, Daphne, I think you were asking about the measurement content. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that two things. One is that the an education like a measurement, a stepwise kind of management information system is not going to be contained in this guidance. However, I think that the IQE measurement framework will be used as the main kind of reference point for looking at the various elements that need to be measured and as a guidance for indicators that should be measured within gender transformative programming. I think that the move, which is in the IQE framework, the move towards including both sector and non-sector, both sector and individual measurements is important, as well as qualitative and quantitative. And then beyond that, I think one of the challenges more broadly as a federation that we face is that we do have very kind of project-specific and different monitoring and evaluation processes. So the guidelines here, within this guideline, the recommendations will be, I would think, to reference the IQE framework, and then more broadly would be kind of providing higher level guidance in terms of what needs to be captured to adequately measure gender transformative education in the areas of, youth voices, in the area of sector change, etc. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Jen. Thanks.
Okay, nice to hear your voice, Nafi. And does anyone else want to provide some thoughts, feedback, anything missing, ideas for the different levels, for the components? Okay. Foster?
Hi, Foster Mkandawe from Plan Malawi.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Yes, I wanted to find out, in light of achieving the gender transformative teaching methodologies, we also need to have our own materials that we can combine with what is already available with the Ministry of Education, so that our work, and if we combine with their work, it must make a difference whenever we are teaching the teachers. So I want to find out if we have the materials that we can come up with a brand that we should be able to deliver a gender transformative teaching methodology.
Yeah, that's a great question, Foster. And I think that you'll find once the gender responsive pedagogical teacher training that was developed by Plan Canada is published, and colleagues from Plan Canada were sharing that will be introduced at an INEE webinar in November. But this is, and I can speak directly to it because I co-designed it, was that it is child-centered and learner-centered teaching pedagogy, but that is gender transformative in nature. So what it does is integrate gender equality and protection into teaching pedagogy that is more responsive and learner-centered. It's a 10-day training that is a step-by-step training and includes all of the training materials in the package. And so hopefully that can be used by the Federation, across the Federation, but also different components can be pulled out as needed to augment existing ministry teacher training. So stay tuned for more from that on that once it gets shared out.
Okay. Thank you.
So is that Nicole? I think, Nicole, you were next to raise your hand.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it was actually a similar point because I was just looking at the school level, and it might be a suggestion is just to include a component of teaching and learning, and that's where the gender responsive pedagogy and teacher training would be listed, just as a suggestion.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part, Nicole? You broke up a little bit for me.
Sorry, yeah. I was just looking at the school level, and I just was suggesting that a component that could be added is teaching and learning, and that was where the gender responsive pedagogy and teacher training aspects could be included as the activity, because I can't see it explicitly stated in that school level.
Yeah, so we've put it at the national level, as I mentioned, Nicole, because the teacher training in particular is usually done in a partnership with the Ministry of Education. And so it's a part of the work that kind of we engage at the national level in terms of getting the support with and partnering up with Ministry of Education, because it's usually in-service, pre-service training of teachers. Whereas the school level activities that happen in the classroom would be more related to the kind of the code of conduct and the school environment and infrastructure that we do at the school level. But I think, I mean, that's just in terms of practically organizing it at different levels. I know the teaching happens at the school, and so, you know, logically it feels like it should live at the school level. We put it at the national level because the engagement in order to make it happen usually happens at the national level, and that teachers are brought together from many different schools to be trained. So that's why it lives at the national level in terms of our organization. But I do see your point, and I mean, if the technical lead team, Yona and Aiden, if you feel it should be at the school level, we can move it there as well. Does that help, Nicole, to answer your question?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I see it at the national level, I guess. Yeah, I mean,
Oh, I think we lost you, Nicole.
Sorry. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Sorry, I see it now in the national, and yeah, look, it's fine. It's a fine decision to make. I mean, I think I was just thinking of the teaching and learning environment at the school level. In that school component is also important, but that's fine.
Absolutely, and I think that if we think about it like how it looks in a practical sense, is that when you train teachers, we typically don't go to each school and train, like we don't go to the school principal and ask to train the teachers in that school. We go to the ministry and say, can we train the teacher trainers? So it usually looks like a training of trainers, and then it gets cascaded down in different districts and communities amongst teachers at different schools. So that's why we've plumped it in the national level. But I see it hopefully ends up translating to change in the classroom. That's the idea. Yeah. Okay, Nicole, if you want to, feel free to email me if you want to continue, if you feel like there are elements that also need to be in both levels, and we can chat. Gabrielle?
Yeah, hi. So my name is Gabrielle. I'm the regional head of gender in the WACA regional office. My question is sort of about how these components and the layers relate in a way to the gender marker, but also to each other. is the guidance going to say, you know, we recommend that you have components at several different layers in one program for it really to be transformative, or is the idea that each component in and of itself should be transformative, if you see what I mean? And then how does this sort of relate to the gender marker?
Well, I'll take the second part of your question first, and then I'll hand the gender marker question over to Aiden and or Yona. I think that it's an excellent question, and of course, I think that, you know, the plan's approach in general is that in order for you know, programs to be truly effective and transformative, we need to achieve change at all of these levels. We can't just change what's happening in the home. We need to change what's happening across the country and policies. We need to change what's happening within institutions and service delivery. So yeah, I think that the guidance will definitely include a comprehensive approach that's responsive to the specific context. And the idea is that, you know, it's difficult to be prescriptive in that, like, if you include X, Y, Z, it is transformative. And I think, you know, many organizations are struggling with that, you know, like, where do you draw a line in terms of this is transformative, not transformative. I think it's something that Aiden and Yona and I and the team will probably further discuss, but I think in terms of being prescriptive, the idea is that insofar as is possible in various contexts, that elements and components within each of these levels should be a part of any transformative education program in order for it to achieve transformative change that is lasting and sustainable. And whether we're going to quantify that in the guidance, I would say probably not, but we might come to some kind of guidelines. But I think we'll come back to that. Aiden, Yona, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gabrielle. Great question. It's one we're acutely aware of the need to make sure that this can complement the gender transformative marker, but also the M&E framework for inclusive quality education. So it's about trying to strike a balance. So ultimately, what we want to make sure that, you know, the 6 elements of change are embedded throughout this, as Jen said, with really concrete examples of, you know, where education can address social and gender norms. What are the, you know, concrete strategies that can be used, so that when colleagues actually have, you know, the gender marker in front of them and they're using it as a tool, they can turn to this guidance while completing the marker. So there's still quite a bit of work to do to see how we can, you know, ensure that those dual processes can complement each other. In terms of the M&E framework, I think the what are the core commitments and the core results, that's going to be key, you know, to make sure that you know, that they're concretely reflected here as well. So I don't know if Helen wants to add anything on that, how this links with the M&E framework.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Helen. Great.
Yeah. Throughout elements of gender transformative education are embedded throughout the M&E framework. And to reply to something that Emilia asked there's been a lot of EIE input into the development of the M&E framework. This part of the consultation, I know it was more difficult for you to include EIE people in the early stages. But within the framework, which is quite long, lots of indicators, pretty complex, gender transformation is throughout that.
Great, thanks. And feel free to send a follow-up to that as well, if needed. Allison?
Hi.
Hi, Allison.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, hi.
You're going to have to move, I think, a tiny bit closer to your microphone for us to hear you.
Okay, let me see if I can increase the volume. Is that better?
Barely.
Well, I'll start, and if you can't hear me, I'll have to write it. I wanted to come back to the point about where we find teaching and learning. Can you hear me? Or should I write it?
Yep, you're quite faint, but go ahead.
I'll carry on. So I just would like to reinforce that I think we should see the point about teaching and learning at the school level as well as the national level. Obviously, I completely take the point that ideally we want to see gender-responsive teaching pedagogy in teacher training, but we know that, well, especially in emergencies, the national level teacher training often isn't relevant. It takes a long time, and also that cascading process we know to be flawed. We can't be sure that it will reach the classroom. And I think, obviously, it depends on the context and the nature of the situation, but I think we need to make sure that it's there at the school level, and we already have elements of it in, for example, teacher no corporal punishment, codes of conduct, etc. But I think it's really important that, especially for the monitoring, I agree, I know that normally we wouldn't go into schools to be training teachers at the school level, but we need to be working with the supervisors and the people who are going into the schools to ensure that they are paying great attention to how the teaching is happening and therefore the learning, because it's really at that level, I think, that the teachers are role modeling a gender transformative approach.
I think that's an excellent point, especially in the context of emergencies, Alison. Thanks for that. Would you be willing to continue a dialogue with me on that outside of this call?
Thanks. So please, do you want me to send you a message? I don't know how.
Yeah, that would be great. You can. My email will be at the end of the presentation, and you can get in touch with me anytime through Yona and Cheryl and Aiden as well. I'd love to continue that conversation. Thanks for that. Alex?
No, thank you, the team, because this is really taking good shape as we continue to really clarify by thematic area what we mean by gender transformative programming. So congratulations to all of you. One thing that I was thinking while I was reviewing again the guidance and the draft is that, like, really how do we get our staff not only to think that we have to do some things differently, but also the how. It's a bit different than the type of questions that one needs to ask yourself before you make a selection in any of these components or activities. And I wonder what has been the experience so far in that process, and how do you see that the larger group could be engaged in that reflection and those challenges that we see in our staff while selecting some strategies to implement?
Sorry, so just so I'm clear, Alex, what you mean in terms of the how is more specific stepwise guidance in terms of how to implement the activities associated with different components at each level?
Yes, but also recognizing that some of the elements that we have in any education programming are quite standard. That you usually do the teacher training, you do the different things, and we can categorize in terms of content of what you do, but also how it's being done in a way that supports our gender transformative processes. So it could be from, as you mentioned there, in terms of really engaging other actors to help us in this process, or new methodologies that really can help us advance, so that we have the guidance in terms of being able to ask the right questions to select the type of strategy that we will be using.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following your specific suggestion. You'd like the guidance to be to include more detail in terms of how to select activities, or how to ensure that those activities
more in terms of really how do we, for example, when we started with the ECD guidance, and I think that it's here already because we're going into that level already, where we really go to say, okay, if you're doing the teacher program, teacher training, these are the type of things that you have to do in order to really advance gender equality agenda. But before you get there, it might be good to have some questions that can help staff think, are you doing the right thing to really promote gender transformative education or not? and have that as an analytical lens that you can use. And of course, the 6 elements is one, and I think it's already here. But I was wondering if in the process of development, if there's something that we could also engage our colleagues to think about what type of challenges they face when making some of these strategic choices for a programmatic response that really wants to advance gender transformative programming in any level. But I think we can take that also on a bilateral as well.
Yeah, Alex, I'd love to talk more about that with you and how you envision it specifically kind of coming into the guidance and what would be most useful for staff in terms of framing those questions. So let's, I'd be more than happy to connect with you, Alex.
Yeah, but congratulations to the team and the whole network. This is fantastic. First one.
Jen, can I just jump in and maybe respond to Alex's suggestion and request about the how? I think, you know, being an education advisor and with Plan for 10 years, both kind of on the programming side and the advocacy and policy side, I see a lot of very common, you know, or similar components in many education programs. We almost, you know, in almost every education program that I've seen, we do teacher training, we engage communities through SMCs, we provide, you know, training and capacity building for local education, Ministry of Education staff. So there's kind of a common set of activities in many education programs across Plan. But the question for us now is, how do we make those components or activities more gender transformative? And so maybe Alex's request to us is to focus or support colleagues to understand, you know, how they bring, you know, those on the kind of spectrum of, you know, gender transformation, if you will, how they, you know, they further us along on that kind of spectrum towards gender transformation. So it's not necessarily about doing things, you know, changing key components of our education programs. So it's just how do we do them in a way that will be more gender transformative, that will consider, will take up gender considerations more. Is that, Alex, is that what I'm hearing you say?
Exactly, Jonna. So I think that's part of the guidance and really will help us shift the way we do programming within the frame that we have. But of course, there may be some additional things that we need to do in any case, but that's a good starting point as well to help be more transformative in our portfolio and interventions.
Yeah, and I think that the idea as well, like Jonna, to further your comment, is that as you said, many people will look at some of these activities or components and they'll be very familiar as a part of their existing education program. But what we want to emphasize is that these activities, while some of them are the usual suspects, quote unquote, that they're interrogated in terms of how transformative they are, actively transformative, and how they can be strengthened to be more so. So great, thanks for that, Alex. But let's also, I'd love to be able to reach out to you for more input on that if I could, Alex. So just being conscious of time and being aware that everyone's taking time out of their busy work days to provide us with feedback here. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I know that we wanted to let you know next steps, as well as where you can reach out to with any case studies or examples that you'd like to share that I said are very, very welcome. As well as any questions or additional comments that perhaps you didn't get a chance to articulate within the call. And perhaps also Aidan and Jonna can give us a sense of when we might have another opportunity to chat as we move through the process. So Aidan, Jonna, I'll hand it over to you for now.
Great, thanks so much, Jen, and thanks everybody for your inputs. This is really helpful as we go to the next stage of writing draft version 2 of this, and we do want to actually get it back out to colleagues across the Federation. There's many colleagues who couldn't join today, for example. So we will be circulating the actual Word draft of this, and we'd really welcome feedback on that as well. So we expect that we'll be able to have that draft ready for circulation within the next 2 weeks. And we also plan to have a second webinar, somewhat based on this, but taking into consideration some of the suggestions from today. So watch out for the date for that, and if you can join, that would be great. I mentioned before that we have the Education Network meeting mid-November. It's a really crucial time for us to be able to see, okay, well, what's missing in this guidance, but then also how do we operationalize it. Stephanie, I noticed your comment around testing. Beyond getting feedback from colleagues in the network, and we want to make sure that we have all levels of feedback considered, from EIE colleagues to colleagues working at country level, regional level, and national organization level. So we want to make sure we have feedback. We haven't considered testing, but we certainly will. Look, I think it's important to make sure that this meets the demand of the organization. So things will be moving, quite progressively over the next 4 weeks, particularly. So they're the main steps in the immediate term that we planned. Yona, anything else you want to add?
No, just to say that this has been incredibly helpful. This work has been going on for quite some time, so we are looking to finalize this guidance fairly soon, but we do want it to be useful for colleagues. So, we will continue taking feedback in writing. Please do get in touch with Jen with any thoughts and constructive kind of advice on how we can make this a more practical, usable guide, keeping in mind that, we do want this to be primarily for programming colleagues, whether they be technical advisors or, program, managers or coordinators, but also to remember that we do have a program and influencing approach. We should not be treating programming and influencing as separate things. And so this guidance should also be useful for influencing colleagues as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Yona, and thanks, Jen, for walking us through the guidance. So just before we wrap up, just one final poll. We'd like to hear from you if this was useful. So the 4 levels are not really, a little, yes, or lots, and that really helps us. It'll help us inform the next webinar that we do and the next stages. So if you just could take a moment before we finalize, that would be fantastic. So again, just click on the A button, which is right beside the hand to vote. Thanks a lot.
Aidan, can you hear me?
Yes.
And you didn't mention where to find all the content, the case studies, etc., and how y'all are sharing your learning information, please.
Great, thanks. Sharon, yes? Fantastic. So we will have a site on Workplace where we can include the files in the IQE network space. So for the moment, that's what we've mainly defined as the place where people can access the drafts. The case studies will be integrated in the draft. So summaries of the case studies, and where available, hyperlinks to the more detailed information around, for example, the GRPTT. So, okay. Somebody else had to, there's 2 people with their hand up. Alison, did you want to come in? If not, we'll just take a look at the final results. So 31% felt that this was a useful webinar, so that's great to hear. 6% felt only a little, so we have some work to do to improve for the next stages, and 10% a lot. That's of half the people who voted. So, okay, thanks everybody for taking the time, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks everybody.